Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to the educator, designer, and historian Teal Triggs. Teal is a professor of graphic design and associate dean at the Royal College of Arts School of Communication. She is also the founding editor of the Journal of Communication Design and has written for publications like I, Design Observer, Visual Communications, and Design Issues. In this conversation, Teal and I talk about her own background and early interest in design, history, and journalism, as well as the value of design research, archives, looking at design history as more than just a collection of objects, and expanding the discourse beyond the often solely Western European canon. I had been wanting to talk to Teal for a while. I've been a huge fan of her writing and research for years, and she had been on my list of dream guests since I started the podcast. So I'm so glad we finally got to have this really wide-ranging conversation about a lot of things that I think are really important subjects in the design discourse that we often don't talk about on this show. So as you can see, I really enjoyed this one, and I think that you will too. So let's get into it. Here is my conversation with Teal Triggs. You're somebody whose work I've known for a while, and in a lot of the kind of design writing that I've been researching and studying, your name kind of comes up again and again. But I don't actually know that much about your background. And so I kind of wanted to start with where your interest in design started, or where did that originate or come from?
That's a really good question, and it's also interesting that you say that in terms of the writing, that I haven't revealed myself necessarily through the text itself over these years that I've been practicing. But in terms of my background, I've got kind of an interesting mix in terms of why I'm here and how I'm here in relationship to graphic design. I grew up in a household where my mom had trained as a journalist, and while she never practiced outside of being one of the editors on her university newspaper, she still had a very strong interest in writing. And my dad had been a painter who had studied with some of the Bauhaus guys out in California. And then he decided that he wanted, I guess, more worldly experience. So he joined the armed services, and he joined the Navy in the first instance, and then decided that the idea of being a pilot, which is what he wanted to do, and land on aircraft carriers that were moving was not a good idea. So he did that for a bit, and then he transferred over to the Air Force.
Okay.
And that, I'm telling that for the reason that I think it's really important that he eventually became a graphic designer, and primarily when he knew he had to settle down, because I was coming along, right. My parents had married at that point, and he needed some kind of economic stability, which the fine art practice wouldn't necessarily gain him. But also in the sense that his kind of training from a precision standpoint impacted how he designed and what he designed. And he was very influenced by kind of a dogmatic Swiss design approach. So when I came along, I come into a household that, was a house that my dad had designed, 1950s in Austin, Texas. And the house is still there. My brother and his wife lived there. My brother's an architect.
Oh, okay.
And he's done some modifications on the house to make it his own. But the original structure is still there with these new additions. But growing up in that kind of household where there was a dogmatic position, but Dad also started teaching at the University of Texas around, I think, 1967, 1968. So right at the crux of, when lots of interesting going on politically, particularly on the UT campus. And I was about 10 years old at that time. And I think it was the fact that he took me to some of the protest rallies against the Vietnam War. the student protest. I got to see that kind of, through the lens of a 10-year-old. But also growing up in a house where there was a lot of graphic ephemera around.
Right.
There were posters on the wall. There was an Eames chair. There was Mad Magazine on the coffee table.
Oh, wow.
And it was just like growing up in Austin, the kind of countercultural thing became absolutely key to raise my awareness about graphic design. So that's kind of where it got started, this kind of combination of, my parents' future life and past life.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because something that I was curious about is in researching you and preparing for this interview, I did see that you studied graphic design in undergrad, and so I was kind of curious about your relationship between design and writing, and so it's interesting that those two things, essentially have been in your entire life.
Yeah, and in fact, my parents used to tell this story, and whether or not it's true, you take it with a pinch of salt. But when I was very young and the kind of first starting to talk and formulate vocabulary, my dad always said that I pointed to the magazine sitting on the table and said, magazine. So that was before I said, hey, Dad, or hey, Mom. It was magazine.
That's
so
amazing.
I think at that point there was kind of a destiny thing going on. So there is this kind of past context and growing up with, literature and text as well as kind of a design atmosphere.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious. This might be skipping around a little bit, or we might be kind of jumping ahead, but I'm kind of just wanting to piece some things together. So you studied. So you went to college and you studied graphic design. What were you thinking, kind of career-wise, or what were your interests at the time? Kind of what were you hoping to do after you had graduated?
Well, I started studying graphic design after originally applying as a music major because I had played piano and wanted to go into music. But then my parents very kindly for high school graduation gave me money to do an art history course in Europe.
Oh, okay.
So MacDonald Smith, who had run the program out of UT Austin, always took a small group of students, and that gave me an opportunity to see a slightly different take on things. And after that, I came back and I enrolled in my dad's graphic design class at UT. Unbeknownst to him, and not exactly pleased to see me because he said, "You're going to never make any money in education or graphic design." So, in terms of kind of where I headed with that and what I thought I might achieve is that I saw something in that particular point in time where designers were not just doing things for good, they were doing things for social good. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, if I can take what I understand the visual to be, at that time it was very much about a visual language rather than the kind of multisensory platforms that we deal with now.
Right.
If I can do something with that, then I want to go into this profession. But I also want to go into a profession because my dad had been such a great educator. And there was something there that I thought, okay, if I could help somebody else, if I could help one student kind of, do something different and achieve something they want to achieve, then education would be interesting. Yeah. So right from the kind of first day, it was that kind of combination of wanting to do both design and education.
I love that. That's so, I've talked to a lot of people and I don't really hear that kind of immediate connection right away. There seems to be one of them comes first and then the other one kind of seems to come later. So when you graduated, did you work as a designer? And the reason I ask is because I know you primarily as a educator, writer, historian, researcher. Was that kind of right away what you were doing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I know my dad is becoming quite central to this story, but in a way, he was a huge impact, but also he facilitated a lot of opportunities for things that I was interested in trying out. And he had a design studio as well as teaching. So I used to spend the weekends in the design studio doing odd jobs like you would in any kind of, look, it's the kid in the back room who needs to make a cup of tea and maybe clean out the old kind of gum machines that we used to use and all that kind of stuff. So I did have this kind of almost apprenticeship through his studio. And through that, he helped kind of facilitate working on small design jobs. And then it kind of grew that I thought, well, okay, there's a small clientele here that are interested in the kinds of things that I'm doing. So I started doing more of that. Had a little bit of a freelance business. Granted, I did a lot of photography at that time as well.
Okay.
And so it was a design photography practice. And then I started working at the University of Texas Press under George Lennox.
Oh, okay.
And because George had run the fourth year design lab. So I got to know him through that. And then he became the head of UT Press Design. And so he hired me as a book designer. So I worked for a number of years as a book designer.
Okay.
So I did do the graft. I promised you.
No, I mean, I was not asking out of any kind of judgment. I always find it interesting of people who, people who are kind of have made their career as historians or writers or researchers, why they decided to turn their gaze to graphic design. And so someone who studied graphic design, but it's kind of primarily, at least for me, from someone on the outside, has made their career in a more academic setting, kind of how those things came together. So it's interesting that, like I said before, they've just always been there for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was whilst working as a book designer and working with George in particular, who he had at one point been head of design at University of Hawaii Press, which had been quite innovative in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And the conversations with him and working closely with him was amazing. And then I started thinking about, where's our history of graphic design?
Yeah.
Where's the kind of critique? How do I know what I'm doing is okay? And where do I fit into this bigger picture? And that's those kinds of questions, working as a practicing, book designer, became absolutely key to me.
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, I'm going to go back and do an MA. There's got to be somebody out there who gets what I'm looking for.
Right.
Unfortunately, there was.
Yeah.
So.
And so, I mean, that exactly was what my next question was going to be, was where the interest in history and kind of how that set you up for what's next. So is that when you went to London then?
No, slight step before that. So I've always been in education. I can't get enough of it. So I did an MA in art history at the University of Texas.
Oh, okay.
And it was at that point I was introduced to Jeffrey Meikle, the great industrial design historian. Yeah. And Jeff had just kind of come out with his book on streamline American, industrial design and so forth. And I thought, man, here's somebody who understands the word design, and there's a history of design.
Yeah.
So I had a really good chance of working with him on my thesis project and taking a couple classes with him. In addition to, the other people that were teaching in the art history department, Linda Henderson in particular, who is quite well known for her work on, early art history and so forth. And she was really good in helping me kind of understand the critical practice of being an art historian and being a writer as well. So that kind of got me started. And then I realized that I was submitting work to an art history department. And so despite these couple of individuals who are absolutely key in formulating my kind of history, it wasn't a design history context.
Right.
So that's when I thought, okay, time to do a second MA and look at, whatever. Look at other places, maybe internationally, because I still had the travel bug.
Right.
where I might be able to look at design history much more specifically in terms of its kind of heritage and tradition and, of course, early development at that time.
Okay.
So there were three programs: University of Cincinnati, which was too cold for me in the winter.
Yeah.
The Royal College of Art, and Middlesex Polytechnic, which is now Middlesex University.
Okay.
The Royal College of Art rejected me, but beautifully and for all the right reasons. So ironically, I'm now there.
Right.
But that was absolutely fine, because what it did, it got me to Middlesex, where I had the real fortune to work with the kind of emerging history of design field. Okay. And the people that were really setting the foundations in kind of a European sensibility of what design history might be. So that all worked out beautifully.
So I have a couple questions kind of around that, and then I kind of want to talk about how that is influencing the work that you're doing today. I'm interested, though, specifically about, kind of working and being in an art history department, basically, and then being in a design history department. Did that change? I'm interested in a couple things around this. Did it change how you thought about your own design practice at that time? And then the inverse, did having a design practice have any influence on how you approached this historical content?
Yes, both. Okay. Both definite yeses. I think coming into a context where design history was actually being understood as an emerging field in its own right, gave me an opportunity to feel more confident. The fact that I was coming in as a practitioner,
right?
Primarily, I mean, yes, I had an MA in art history, but I would never say that I was an art historian. I didn't practice art history in that kind of way that many, of the great colleagues that I've had are able to do. So it allowed me to feel that it was okay to talk about design history as someone who had been engaged in the practice of design history.
Right.
And that I hoped that what I understood, particularly in graphic design, would help inform the way we write about design or the way that we look at the artifacts of graphic design.
Yeah. I mean, so this is great, because this is something that I was really interested in talking to you about. Something I've been thinking about a lot, and from what I've read of your work, I think this is something that you've thought about a lot also, or, fingers crossed, I hope that it is. But something I've been thinking about a lot is the way a lot of design history, and specifically graphic design history, has become a history of the object or the artifact. And what often gets lost in that is, modes of working, practice, the kind of theories around these things. And I'm really interested in kind of how you think about that, and kind of what gets lost in translation in that kind of mapping of history, and how we can kind of better understand the historical context around which these things were made.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I was talking to some of our students yesterday in this lecture on, it was actually a seminar on graphic design exhibitions. Mm-hmm. And this is an area that I've become really fascinated by, because I think we're now far enough along in defining this kind of potential trajectory for graphic design history specifically.
Yeah.
And I'll get to the point about how it might be different from other design histories, if at all. I think it is. That we are in a really unique position in our understanding of graphic design and in being designers, graphic designers, that we've been in positions which could be art directors, working with large teams, pulling together ideas, dealing with audiences directly. And it's not just about consumer culture, but it's about the facilitation of participatory cultures or services or, all that kind of thing that, graphic design has broken out into, and it's no longer just about, hey, let's design a poster.
Right.
It's great because we still need printed posters. I'm all for print.
Yeah.
But it's no longer necessarily defined by being a service.
Right.
That I think it has expanded. So we are kind of looking at an expanded practice for graphic design. So I think all that helped me in terms of understanding a graphic design history, that we can be authors, that we can be the designers of, but we can also be the historians of, and we're the practitioners of, and bloody hell, we can be the critics of it as well, because there's an inherent understanding. And it does raise questions about objectivity, which we can talk about. But I think in terms of looking at a history and help defining that history and understanding that history, there's a nice way into it as a practitioner. You have the nuanced understanding of the profession, but that profession's not always visible. And if it's visible, we know historically that we were seen as wallpaper, and if it worked, you didn't see the artifact at all.
Right.
So it's always been slightly problematic in that sense when you want to talk about this graphic design history, getting at it. I think it's been a little difficult than, say, industrial design history or product history, which has those artifacts right at the foreground of it.
Yeah, this is something interesting that I actually hadn't thought of before. So I'm about to kind of give a train of thought that I'm not sure is going to, match up exactly. But I talked to Michael Rock, who quoted, I think it was Bruno Latour, who said that design has moved kind of in kind of cultural consciousness, has moved from the end of the process to the beginning of the process, where
Absolutely.
you kind of don't really start any project unless there's a designer involved in some way. How does that change how you think about your work as a historian or an educator? And you started touching on this already, but like, how do you, this is becoming a very big question, but how do you think about teaching that? Or how do you think about cataloging that as a historical moment in time?
Yeah, that is a big question. Okay. Let me think about it. So let me talk about it from the point of being a researcher.
Okay.
That might be a little bit easier, and then we can look at how that might be disseminated or brought into an educational kind of context. So I think as a researcher, I'm still very active bringing a graphic design lens and a design historian's lens to big research projects. So we do a lot of work with industry. So the RCA has a long tradition of reaching out in industrial context and looking at that relationship between what an academic institution can bring, new ways of thinking on innovation or whatever it happens to be in terms of an industrial professional practice context. So we've been working with clients who still see graphic design as something that is an end process. So it's about the packaging of something, or it's about the branding of something. And we're talking about, international corporations.
Yeah.
So we've worked really hard to kind of pull that back into that understanding that we do need to be at the beginning. So I think whereas other design areas have kind of conquered that aspect, I think we're still a little bit slow into getting to the table very early on.
Yeah.
So I think that's something we need to break down a bit more in terms of, professional context or professional. So by being right at the beginning of that, I think graphic designers, knowing that you have to have some kind of outcome, but you don't know what that outcome is going to be, have the capability of asking very pointed questions to the people that they're working with or with the client or whatever kind of context it happens to be, in directing and moving forward in a much more iterative process and coming in rather pointedly and not just saying, is that going to work, but is it going to communicate?
Right.
Is it going to get across what you need it to get across? Are we actually matching up the right methods to allow us to do that? And more interestingly, what are the methods we might innovate in order to do that process to get us to the end? So I think we've been really good, and particularly in the kind of British context of service design and communication design, where graphic designers are kind of forming the basis of these new emerging disciplines, that it is about that sense of communication and the tools through which that act is encountered and engaged with. And that's where I think it's just slightly different. And that we are generalizing, so I want to make it clear.
Yeah.
And I know designers in general go through a similar process, but I think it's back to this kind of core of the communication and what that actually does in terms of a design process.
Yeah.
And our understanding of communication as a result.
I kind of want to hold on to this thread for a little bit, and I really find that answer really interesting, and I'm curious about how you kind of apply that way of thinking to your teaching practice. And so my first question is, are you I guess very simply, who are you teaching, and kind of, what types of classes are you teaching? Like are you teaching people who will become practicing designers, or are you teaching people who are going to be kind of design writers, historians, things like that, or is it both? And then how do you kind of educate students about that way of thinking? And the reason I ask that question is I'm thinking back to my own undergraduate education that was very formalist and practical, and it was very much kind of rooted in the modernists' philosophy of, here's how you make a grid, here are the good typefaces, here are the bad typefaces, here's how you make a pleasing layout, that kind of doesn't hit at all of that other stuff about communication and how it lives in the environment that it's going to be seen in.
Yeah. Okay. So who I teach and how I teach and what I teach. First of all, at the Royal College of Art, we don't teach in the kind of conventional sense that you're referring to.
Okay.
First of all, it's a wholly postgraduate institution, which means we've got MAs and PhDs and
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So in terms of an undergraduate program, we don't have that within our institution. So it gives a kind of a different take.
Yeah, I completely missed that somehow.
Yeah, I have taught extensively on undergraduate programs prior to coming to the RCA. But I think, and we could talk about those undergraduate programs, which I have absolutely adored doing for a whole host of other reasons.
Yeah.
But in terms of being at the RCA, what it's actually done is gotten me to think differently about how I teach and what I teach. So I think there is a relationship to what you're saying here, or asking a question around. So in the sense that we're not teaching, we're actually very much involved in learning. So learning becomes quite active, and learning is about a dialogue or a conversation. And you're dealing with a level of student, and I don't mean level in terms of being brighter than anybody else or what have you.
Right, yeah.
But a level in terms of experience. So a lot of our students have been out already working in design practice or related areas. And we get a lot of students from sciences as well. So we've got a really interesting cohort with a good mixture there. We do have students who've been undergraduates that come into the MA as, directly. So they haven't necessarily had that break. And that's what I find exciting about the MA programs, in particular, is you've got a really interesting mix of educational experiences, cultural experiences, professional practice experiences, but in both cases, multiple sets of questions. Who am I? And what am I doing here? Yeah. And where do I fit into this big thing called design?
Yeah.
Or fine art if you're in the School of Fine Art, or what have you at the RCA. But in terms of the kind of mix that we have in the school, my role is primarily managerial. I'm an associate dean, and that's also been really great for me to be able to be in a position of working with Neville Brody in the first instance, and creating a a kind of culture within the school, if not more broadly, about understanding process,
Right.
understanding innovation, and understanding that relationship between the kind of academic and the professional practice and the industry context. So a lot of that has kind of seeped into curriculum development with the aid of, some wonderful staff members who, contribute significantly to curriculum development. But I think we're all providing a framework and a space in which the students are at the center of that, mm-hmm. and they're driving this game. They're at the edge of something. But we have the experience to ask the questions.
Yeah.
And to help guide them through that process, or bring out the Kleenex box if we need to.
Right. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of identity crisis taking on when you're having to stand back from being a designer, or standing back from being an undergraduate student, and who am I now, and where do I want to be, and how do I get there? So we're asking the same kind of questions of graphic design. Who am I?
Right.
And how do I actually get to a position where graphic design is a bona fide discipline with a history, with a theory, and with a critical practice that goes along with them. So that's part of it. But I want to say that I also do PhD students.
Oh, okay.
And I think that in terms of my teaching, I do input on the MA programs, but my heart at the moment has been primarily in developing a program or a framework where our PhD students can flourish, that they can really get on with their own potential, and working with supervisory teams and bringing in guests and researchers and various other people dealing in research methods or theoretical practices to help facilitate what is normally a very isolating experience, being a sole researcher.
Right.
Most of our students are practitioners in some kind of way, and we extend that to writing.
Okay.
So, we don't separate out the kind of act of making something or the act of intellectually engaging with something. That is about a practice.
Yeah.
And so we're there to help facilitate and help provide that framework for the students to get on with their own, particular subject areas and expertise. That
is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about next. I have a small question that I want to ask first about the PhD students. What are, I don't know how to ask this without it sounding kind of like a flippant question, but I'm interested in kind of, what does a student come into the PhD program, what are they seeking, and kind of what are they kind of headed towards, and what are you kind of directing them or kind of advising them in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's actually one of the first things when someone contacts me and they say, I'm interested in doing a PhD. And I turn it right back to them and say, why do you want to do a PhD? But it's to help an individual candidate actually think about, is it a project that they want to do? Or is it a piece of in-depth, investigative research, which has its own conventions and its own way of being within an academic community.
Right.
You can have projects in PhDs, but they're framed in particular ways. They need to be systematic and rigorous in how they get put together, and the evidencing needs to be there, and all the other conventions of a PhD. So I think we ask that question right up front. In terms of some of the reasons that people come in to do a PhD, we get some candidates who are quite keen to have an academic career. So like any other academic career, a PhD is kind of part of that career journey that they need to undertake. Although we are very careful that it's not about just giving somebody a PhD because they want to be an educator.
Right.
They still have to have a soul. They still have to have a reason for doing something.
Yeah.
because it won't sustain them for the period of time. It's a 3-year full-time commitment or a 6-year part-time commitment. That's a lot of years to give over to.
That's intense.
Yeah, it's very intense. So we get that kind of rationale. We get designers getting to a point where they're either being asked to engage in more research in the professional context that they're dealing with, and they want to look at areas of innovation. Mm-hmm. So it may be something around materials or production processes or methods that will help them in their own practice be able to develop those ideas in those kinds of contexts. But nonetheless, it still needs to have the same kind of, systematic and rigorous approach. Yeah. And in all cases, it's about what's your contribution to new knowledge.
Right.
What's that little tiny gap, that you're trying to fill, and allowing other researchers after you to question that or to build on that. Mm-hmm. So it's that every student has a different reason for coming in, and for me, that's part of the excitement. Yeah. Because the learning day is never the same.
Right. Yeah.
So every time I meet a student, there's a different set of discussions that are undertaken.
That. Yeah. I want to come back to something that you had said kind of before I asked specifically about the PhD students, about the relationship between design and writing and kind of seeing those as one type of practice and another type of practice. And I think a lot of what I've been doing, or at least what I hope I'm doing with this podcast, is showing that thinking and making are not two opposing activities, and that design theory and design practice do not have to be separated. And so I'm curious about how you think about that, both at a personal level in your own work, and then also kind of stepping back and for the profession at large, how those things relate to each other.
Yeah, I really do believe that, as you're suggesting, that there is not a division for me between the thinking and the making, or the writing and the designing.
Yeah.
That, you can design a piece of text as much as you can design a poster.
Right.
And the kinds of processes that you go to in terms of thinking through that text, where you're setting up a proposition, you're interrogating that or describing that in some way, and then you're reaching a set of conclusions. It's the same in graphic design. And again, it's about communication. As a writer, you're talking to somebody out there. Mm-hmm. As a designer, you're talking to somebody out there. So whilst there's some nuance differences, I would say generally that it really is a same kind of process for me. And it's something that I'm very keen to engage with students on, that, it is about not feeling intimidated by writing.
Right.
Because that's what you often get. I'm a designer, therefore I'm not a writer.
Right.
But we're starting to see a number of students in the visual communication MA, and the other MAs we have as well, but the ones I've been working with closely, really engaging with written text as part of their toolkit as communicators.
Yeah.
And so we've got a substantial number of these kids doing research projects which are resulting in books.
Oh, interesting.
Which they are, they're publishing. So they're going through the full publishing cycle.
Yeah.
And also developing new ecologies around publishing futures as well as a result.
Right.
But the written word is just seen as another design element in a process of wanting to communicate to a particular kind of audience.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely key.
I'm interested in, I think it's interesting that many of your students are producing books that are kind of being written and designed, and something that I'm really interested in is just the, in general, kind of contemporary design discourse. And I'm curious, I don't know I'm going to be honest, I don't know exactly how to frame the question that I'm trying to articulate right now, but I'm interested in what are the, what is lacking in your view in contemporary design discourse and the things we talk about design. And I'm interested in that question from you from like even a historical perspective of the way designers have thought about their work in history, and how that's influencing contemporary designers. I don't know if that
Yeah, well, let me see if I can start with an answer and see if it's hitting the mark on what you're trying to say. So just from a personal perspective and things that I've been quite interested in, and what I've kind of banged on about for a long period of time, is that in terms of kind of creating this canon of graphic design, it as writers, we're contributing to that canon because we're fixing it in a text that's in a book that sits on a shelf, or is in digital space, or is in a podcast. So we have to be really aware that whilst there are a lot of great, white middle-class male designers in this world, there's equally the same number of, women, different cultural practices, different kinds of experiences. So that notion that we've kind of, we're in danger of falling into the trap of history and establishing these really firm canons. And I think it's so important that as a historian and as an educator, that we're kind of saying, okay, how can we look for or discover or rediscover people working in other areas, people working in different ways, other countries, which, face it, we've been very westernized, almost Anglo-American in many ways in terms of graphic design and its history, that we need to kind of not break out of it in the sense of, dishing it or discarding it, because it is part of our history, but really problematizing it. And I think that's just an area in terms of, alternative ways of looking at something, but that shouldn't be alternative. It should be the same as.
Right. I've mentioned this to other people that I've talked to. So for people who have listened to other episodes, I'm probably starting to sound like a broken record a little bit, but something that I think about a lot, and it's what you're kind of hitting at a little bit also in thinking about design history and its application for practicing designers today, is that, and this is coming back to our earlier discussion about kind of history of objects versus history of practice, is that somewhere along the way, the kind of Bauhaus Swiss modernist theories of design became not theories, but, law almost. And that just became the way that design was taught, and that was a set of theories by a small group of white men in a very specific time. And how, and that's just wrong, to kind of still think that is, quote unquote, the way to design, I think. How do you think about using history to kind of break out of that a little bit today? Or how do you start to go about that?
Yeah, no, again, this is a really good question. So one of the things that you may know is I'm incredibly passionate about archives. And of course, archives are these kinds of receptacles or containers of different kinds of histories, and they're curated collections. They have positions or perspectives on, our worldviews. And I'm really interested in getting students and designers into archives and enlivening them in some kind of way, and using them as kind of not only understanding a history, because I think that's really important, but understanding it's not the history either. And what is it that they can do to make it their history? So, really kind of bring this to a fore. So it's about using the past and using the kinds of strategies of history and history documentation and so forth to understand how we construct something. So what kinds of narratives are we actually constructing through these artifacts or through these practices that are in these archives? And we've got students who are just absolutely thrilled to be sitting in the middle of archives. And I think part of it, of course, is history's come full circle in terms of, hey man, everybody's been on their computer for a long time. All this screen stuff, I'm getting sick of it. I want to get back to the physicality, the materiality of the book, or hold that poster or what have you. So these kids are just jumping into these archives, and for me, just watching that process and having conversations with them about it, it gives a new sense of history for me. That it's not about my perspective anymore. It's about their perspective, and gosh, isn't that kind of interesting? Yeah. And how can we now problematize this and have a conversation? So I think that's, again, where history and practice can really come together, and it's not negating, but it's another set of skills and capabilities to question, to understand, to problematize what it is that we're actually seeking. Where are we moving toward? What's the future of all this? Yeah,
I love that. I have just a couple questions. I know we're starting to get short on time, so I have just a couple questions to kind of wrap it up a little bit. This podcast is kind of ostensibly about graphic design criticism and how we talk about design. And we started talking about this a little bit, but I'm interested in, and this is a question that I ask everybody that I talk to, what are the kind of issues or topics or subjects that designers should kind of be turning their kind of critical gaze on today, or the things that are not being talked about enough right now?
Okay. I think we still need to talk about gender and the canon and what that history actually is, and be critical of it, but constructive in understanding. The emerging area of the decolonization of design, it's really taking off, it's always kind of been there, but it's really come to the fore now in terms of a younger generation really wanting to critique this, and why is it the way it is, and why haven't we done anything about it, and what can we do about it? And so I think it's a really important area. I think the other area I'm interested in terms of criticism has to do with education. So how can we critique the very structures that, as graphic design educators or design educators more broadly have instilled, and you referred to some of those previously. How do we actually, look at that and understand that and improve on it? So how do we build on it? So I think these, for me, are the kinds of areas that are kind of naturally emerging in the kind of discourse, but we've still got real gaps. And my one kind of call for your listeners is that graphic design research. I mean, we're, in terms of a really strong sense of what research might be in this field, whether it's through practice or critical practice or theoretical or whatever, we're not doing enough of it. We're engaging in all sorts of forms of brilliant journalism, and some cases it becomes flippant journalism, and as journalism itself already has. But what I would love to see, because we do have so many graphic designers writing in one capacity or another, and a number of outlets now, and I know Rick Pointer would have say about that, but I feel we still have quite a few venues. That why aren't we also looking at what research really is, and that evidence-based way? And until we can do that in graphic design, then the kind of academic community and the professional context in which our students are going out to, there's a gap, there's a disconnect at the moment. And I just think it's so important that we ask academic staff, but students as well, to look at what are the ways we can be researching. That can be through the visual, but it's an articulation of ideas, propositions, and findings that was quite interesting. And it could be through the text and the more conventional ways of academic publishing. But that's a big gap for me, and that's where the kind of critical, whether it's talking about a critique or it's criticism as a practice, or what I've become quite interested in is using the strategies of research with people like Chris Frayling, who talked about, design through and for and into. I'm interested in what criticism is when you look at it through a research lens.
Yeah.
So what's criticism through, for, into, about, and so forth.
Right.
So I think those are areas that, for me are really, really exciting. And there's a few people kind of dotted around the world that are probing into this. Most of them tend to be young PhDs who are, in a good space to be able to do that. But I think these are areas that, to be taken seriously by the broader design community, we need to really establish these areas.
I'm so mad that you brought this up kind of right at the end of our time, because I feel like I have, 20 other questions that I could kind of ask you that I would love to talk to you about that. My last question, just to wrap it up, though, is I'm really interested. This is a two-part question. I'm interested in kind of one, I'm very curious about who are the kind of the designers, the writers, the historians, the critics who have really influenced your own work and the way you think about your work. And that doesn't need to be people in the design profession, but who has kind of influenced the way you think about this. And then the second thing, which connects it back to kind of what you're talking about with research, is who are those people or the books or things like that for designers who are interested in that kind of practice? Where would you point them to kind of introduce them to thinking about this stuff?
In other words, what's my reading list?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a better way to say it, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Right. But that's a really good question, because it depends on what day of the week it is and what I'm actually engaging with and which hat I have on.
Yeah.
I think in terms of my own personal influences, somebody I met really early on when I was an MA student in art history at UT Austin was Victor Margolin.
Oh, yeah.
And, you can't get much better as a historian as somebody like Victor.
His collection, his edited collection, Design Discourse, from like 1989 is sitting right here next to me right now.
Excellent. Okay, we're on the same wavelength then. But Victor was really amazing and kind of introducing me to the world of potential with graphic design and history and critical thinking. He got me to apply to the first symposium on the history of graphic design, and I gave a paper as an MA student there.
Oh, cool.
To varying levels of success, as I recall. I was absolutely terrified that you had all these major figures, Roger Remington and Barbara Dick and, Steve Heller, all these people sitting in the audience. So I've always, credited him as someone who kind of gave me a really good insight and a firm foundation of what it could be. Mm-hmm. And then I just had to figure out how to get there. And the kinds of things that kind of helped me get there were people like Sheila LeBron-Bretteville.
Yeah.
And looking at how she was writing about feminism and critical practice, and then how she was engaging in that critical practice herself.
Yeah.
And then kind of on the other end of that, Kathy McCoy.
Oh, yeah.
And in terms of kind of the theoretical and looking at the kind of use of language in graphics and how do we understand that from a theoretical perspective and postmodernism and deconstruction and so forth. She was a strong influence on me as well. So I think those were kind of the my early formulated folk in terms of graphic design specifically.
Yeah.
I will say that you can't see, but I've got hundreds of thousands of books in this house. And that's why I say any day of the week I could, pick up off my desk an Umberto Eco book, to a Calvino book, to a recent book that I went to an event last night for the C-Red women's feminist group. So again, the kind of politics of graphic language. So they were actually quite instrumental. And then when I was doing my PhD, Michael Twyman, again, another very distinguished historian, really taught me something about listening and working within a field that we hadn't quite collected all of our history yet, and to write about fanzines,
Right.
and
Yeah, of course.
more contemporary aspects of history and criticism for graphic design was okay, despite other people kind of questioning that. So they were kind of my people, and I still use their writings in the classroom.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I'll pull that back into my teaching, because I think there's a timelessness to what all these people had been doing.
Yeah.
And, they're all kind of still writing in some kind of capacity or another. But I think that just really helped formulate my approach to education and this kind of broader perspective.
Right.
That it's not just about this poster.
Yeah.
It's about to go around it and what makes up the poster, and then how we understand that poster.
Right.
So that plus, we could be here for another hour,
yeah.
and we could share our reading list, which I think would be fantastic, which I think we should do.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation, because like you just said, I feel like I could have easily talked to you for another hour. This was so interesting to me. I really loved this conversation a lot. And just want to thank you for your time and for sharing, a lot of the way you think about this stuff, because I think a lot of this is stuff that I've been thinking about a lot, but maybe, haven't really been able to articulate, and are subjects that don't often come up in these interviews. So thank you so much. This was really, really so interesting to me.
Well, Jared, I really appreciate the opportunity to ramble on, so my apologies for that. But no. I think what you're doing is brilliant, and I think the nature of these podcasts and capturing some of these moments and the way designers and historians and critics think about what they're doing is a really good project, and a real contribution to the field. So thank you.
Thanks. That means so much. That really is the best compliment. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This episode was recorded on May 5th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.